The gravel of the courtyard ground beneath the soles of my stiff leather shoes, the sound entirely too loud against the oppressive quiet of the late afternoon. I stood perfectly still, my white-collared shirt clinging uncomfortably to my shoulders in the humid, breezeless air, staring blankly at the intricate stone paving near the estate's front steps. The white floral arrangements, towering and pristine inside their glass lanterns, smelled like decay masked by forced elegance. I hated them. I hated the structural instability of the rented folding chairs scattered across the lawn, bowing under the weight of people who were already leaving, and I hated the absolute, hollow void in my chest where my breathing used to happen. "You shouldn't be alone tonight." The voice broke my rigid focus, cutting through the low hum of departing cars. I turned slowly, my back shifting away from the arched masonry doorway of the estate. Maria stood there. She was framed by the creeping ivy of the old stone facade, wearing a light lavender slip dress with thin straps that seemed entirely out of place for a day of mourning, yet somehow perfectly defiant against the crushing grayness of the afternoon. Her blonde curls fell loose and unkempt around her shoulders, catching the fading amber light of the sun. She was clutching a crumpled white tissue against her chest, right over her heart, her knuckles white with the strain of holding on to something so small. Her eyes, rimmed with a deep, bruised exhaustion, held a heavy, terrible understanding. The silence between us stretched out, thick and unyielding. It demanded a response, a comfort I did not have the vocabulary to build. "I'm fine," I said. It was a lie, short and clipped. A singular, cracking, load-bearing pillar expected to hold up a collapsing roof. "Jaxon," she whispered, her voice carrying a slight tremor that made the muscles in my jaw tighten involuntarily. "The house is too quiet. I can't listen to the floorboards settle by myself, not tonight." I looked at the way she held that tissue, like a lifeline over a sinking ship. I didn't want to step back into that cavernous, silent house, the one I had spent the last 2 years reinforcing, checking sheer walls and securing the foundation for a future that was just abruptly canceled by a patch of black ice. But I looked at Maria, at the sheer grief threatening to buckle her knees right there on the paving stones, and the engineer in me recognized a structure about to fail catastrophically. I gave a single, curt nod. I didn't offer a comforting platitude or a gentle touch. I just turned and opened the heavy oak door for her, stepping aside to let her cross the threshold first. It was a quiet surrender to the reality that we were now the only 2 people left in the world who understood the exact, crushing dimensions of this particular tragedy. The transition from the humid porch to the cool, shadowed foyer felt like stepping into a mausoleum. The ambient temperature dropped, the heavy plaster walls absorbing the sound of the front door clicking shut behind us. I reached out and threw the deadbolt. The heavy metallic slide that echoed down the long central hallway. Maria dropped her keys onto the antique console table. The metal hit the wood with a sharp clatter. She didn't take off her shoes. She just stood in the center of the Persian rug, staring at the grand staircase as if she had never seen it before. Her shoulders were trembling, a rapid, fine vibration that traveled down her arms. I didn't know how to navigate this. My instinct, honed by years of blueprints and stress tests, was to isolate the problem and apply a physical fix. But grief wasn't a structural deficit. It couldn't be braced or shored up with steel. I walked past her, my boots heavy on the hardwood. "Tea," I grunted, a single syllable. I didn't wait for her to answer. I moved into the kitchen, the layout painfully familiar. I filled the copper kettle, the rush of water against metal the only sound in the cavernous room. I set it on the gas range, twisting the knob until the blue flame roared to life. I leaned against the marble counter, crossing my arms tightly over my chest, staring at the flame. I was waiting for the water to boil, but really I was just waiting for the next minute to pass. then the next. Maria walked into the kitchen a few minutes later. She had wrapped a thick, woven throw blanket over her lavender dress, drowning herself in the fabric. She pulled out a bar stool and sat down, pulling her knees up to her chest. "The silence is loud," she said, her voice raspy. I pulled 2 ceramic mugs from the cabinet. "Yeah." "She used to leave the radio on in here. Always." Maria stared at the empty space beside the refrigerator. "Even when she wasn't in the room. Just to have noise." I gripped the handle of the kettle as it began to whistle, the heat radiating against my knuckles. I poured the water over the tea bags, watching the dark liquid bloom. I didn't have a response to her memory. Every time I tried to picture the radio or the way the kitchen used to smell, my throat closed up entirely. I slid a mug across the marble island toward her. "Drink," I instructed. She wrapped her hands around the warm ceramic, letting the steam rise against her face. We sat there, in the fading light, 2 survivors on a very small, very fragile life raft. The house around us groaned as the evening air cooled the timber framing. It was a normal sound, thermal contraction, but tonight, it sounded like the house itself was grieving. I needed to focus on the structure. I needed an anchor. The heavy brass knocker on the front door pounded 3 times, the sound violently shattering the fragile quiet. Maria jumped, splashing hot tea onto the marble counter. Her eyes darted toward the hallway, wide and panicked. "Who is that?" she whispered. "Everyone left." I didn't answer. I grabbed a dish towel, wiped up the spill with one swift motion, and walked out of the kitchen. My stride was deliberate, heavy. I approached the front door, looking through the narrow sidelight pane. Standing on the porch was John Wong. He was my late wife's estranged uncle, a man who dealt exclusively in liquidations and legal loopholes. He was wearing a sharp, dark suit that looked too expensive for his posture, holding a thick leather briefcase. He checked his gold watch, then raised his hand to knock again. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, blocking the entryway with my frame. I didn't step back to invite him in. "Jaxon," John said, his lips curling into a smile that failed to reach his flat, calculating eyes. "Tragic times. Truly heartbreaking. I would have stayed longer at the service, but the logistics of these things are always so messy." "What do you want, John?" My voice was low, a gravelly rumble that lacked any trace of social etiquette. He didn't flinch. He just patted the leather of his briefcase. "I need to speak with Maria. It's regarding the estate. My brother's name is still technically on the master deed of this property. Unless you two can produce the transfer documents signed before the accident, this entire property goes into probate by the end of the month." The ambient temperature in my veins dropped to freezing. John wasn't here to offer condolences. He was here to initiate a hostile takeover of the only shelter Maria had left. This house had been in her family for 3 generations, passed down through a complex trust, but the final transfer paperwork was supposed to have been completed last year. "The transfer was signed," I stated, stating a concrete fact. "Was it?" John tilted his head, feigning sympathy. "Because the county clerk has no record of it. And without the physical Addendum B document proving survivorship rights, the house reverts to the primary creditor of my late brother's estate." He tapped his chest. "Which is me." I felt the muscles in my forearms bunch beneath my shirt. I didn't yell. I didn't posture or threaten him. I simply stood my ground, my posture rigid, locking my jaw. "Leave," I said. One word, absolute. "You have 30 days, Jaxon," John replied smoothly, pulling a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. He held it out. When I didn't take it, he dropped it onto the porch mat at my feet. "After that, I'm putting padlocks on the doors. Tell Maria I'm sorry for her loss." He turned and walked back down the gravel driveway toward his luxury sedan. I stood in the doorway until his taillights disappeared down the road. I didn't look at the envelope on the mat. I looked at the structural columns supporting the porch roof, noting the slight weather damage near the base.
Jaxon?
Maria was standing at the end of the hallway, her hands gripping the edges of her blanket. She had heard everything. The color had completely drained from her face, leaving her looking fragile, like spun glass right before it shatters.
He's going to take it,
she breathed, her voice breaking.
He's going to take her home. It's all I have left.
I finally looked down, picking up the envelope. It was heavy, full of legal threats and deadlines. I closed the front door, engaging the deadbolt once more. I walked toward her, stopping 3 feet away to maintain a respectful, safe distance. I looked at her terrified eyes. I couldn't rebuild the person we lost, but I was a structural engineer. I solved physical impossibilities for a living. "We have 30 days, I said, my voice flat, devoid of panic. "The document is in this house." She didn't trust banks.
"This house is 10,000 square feet,
Maria whispered, the tears spilling over her lower lash line. "She hid things in books under floorboards. We'll never find it." I looked around the grand foyer, analyzing the load paths, the decorative molding, the hollow cavities between the lath and plaster walls. "I will map it," I told her, "every inch. We eliminate the impossible one room at a time." The following morning, the estate transitioned from a place of mourning into a systematic excavation site. I approached the search with the brutal, meticulous methodology of a load path analysis. I woke up at 5 a.m., my body stiff from a few hours of sleep on the leather sofa in the study. I bypassed the kitchen entirely, heading straight for my truck to retrieve my heavy tool bags. When I walked back into the house, Maria was already awake. She was sitting on the floor of the library, surrounded by dozens of cardboard boxes filled with old tax returns, photo albums, and loose paper. She was wearing faded jeans and a t-shirt, her hair tied back in a messy knot. She looked exhausted, her movements frantic and uncoordinated as she rifled through a stack of old bank statements. "You're awake," I noted, dropping my heavy canvas bags onto the hardwood floor with a solid thud. She jumped slightly, looking up at me. "I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I just saw John putting padlocks on the doors."
"I have to find it, Jaxon."
I looked at the chaotic piles of paper surrounding her. It was inefficient. Panic-driven labor yielded low results. "Stop," I commanded gently. She froze, holding a handful of receipts. I opened my tool bag and pulled out a rolled-up blueprint of the house. I had pulled the original 1920s architectural schematics from the county archives 2 years ago when I started reinforcing the foundation. I unrolled the heavy paper across the mahogany desk, using 4 heavy brass paperweights to hold the corners down. "Come here," I said. She stood up, brushing dust from her jeans, and walked over to the desk. I pulled a red mechanical pencil from my shirt pocket. "This is not a random search," I explained, tracing the outline of the ground floor with the graphite tip. "We are dealing with physical volume. A legal document requires a certain amount of space to remain flat and protected from moisture. That eliminates 70% of the house immediately." Maria leaned in, her eyes following the red lines. "Where do we start?" "We start with the anomalies," I said. "Areas where the decorative facade does not match the structural necessity." I tapped the pencil on a thick line denoting the wall between the library and the main hallway. This load-bearing wall is framed with 2x6 timber, but the plaster depth indicates a 10-inch cavity, 4 inches of dead space. "A hiding place," she breathed, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Yes." I put the pencil down and picked up a high-density acoustic scanner. It was a specialized tool meant for detecting voids in concrete retaining walls. Not looking for lost paperwork, but the physics were the same. "You manage the paper trails. Sort by year, discard anything predating the trust formation. I will handle the physical architecture." I didn't wait for her to agree. I walked over to the suspect wall, turned the scanner on, and pressed the flat sensor pad against the vintage wallpaper. The device hummed quietly in my hand. I dragged it slowly along the baseboard, watching the digital readout. Solid wood, plaster. Maria watched me for a moment, the frantic energy leaving her shoulders, replaced by a focused, grounded determination. She sat back down among the boxes and began to sort, one piece of paper at a time. The days blurred together into a continuous loop of dust, silence, and methodical destruction. I dismantled custom oak shelving units, carefully prying the trim away with a flat bar so as not to damage the original wood. I crawled through the attic insulation wearing a respirator mask, mapping the joist bays with a flashlight. I checked every loose floorboard, every hollow-sounding stair tread. By the end of the first week, the physical toll of the search was deeply ingrained in my body. My hands were covered in micro-abrasions from handling rough timber, the grit of century-old plaster permanently embedded in my cuticles. My back ached with a dull, constant throb from crouching in cramped crawl spaces. It was a Tuesday evening. The sun had gone down, plunging the house into deep shadow, save for the harsh, artificial glare of my halogen work lights. I was in the master bedroom, on my knees, carefully removing a section of baseboard near the heavy stone fireplace. Maria walked into the room carrying a tray with 2 glasses of ice water and a plate of sandwiches. She set the tray down on a nearby dresser with a quiet clink. "You need to eat," she said. I paused, a pry bar gripped tightly in my right hand. I didn't look up immediately. I was staring at a small gap behind the plaster, hoping to see the edge of a lockbox. Nothing. Empty space and dust. I sighed, a rough, grating sound, and sat back on my heels. I looked at Maria. She looked incredibly fragile. The dark circles under her eyes were profound, her skin pale. She was running on adrenaline and fear, terrified of stopping. I recognized the symptom. It was the same mechanism keeping me moving. But while I was built to handle physical strain, she was breaking down. "Sit," I told her, pointing to the edge of the large armchair near the window. She shook her head stubbornly. "I have 3 more boxes from the study to go through. I can't stop, Jaxon. John called the lawyer today. He asked for an inventory of the antique furniture." The mention of John's name sent a spike of cold fury through my chest. But anger wasn't a tool. It didn't solve problems. I stood up, wiping the plaster dust from my jeans with heavy, calloused hands. I walked over to the dresser, picked up a glass of water, and held it out to her. "Sit," I repeated. The tone was not a request. It was a structural command, a boundary. She looked at the glass, then at my face. She let out a long, shaky breath and sank into the armchair, her posture collapsing slightly. I handed her the water. She took a sip, the ice clinking against the glass. I didn't sit down. I stayed on my feet, giving her space, acting as a windbreak against the panic. "You are not processing data efficiently," I stated, using cold logic to mask the protective instinct tightening my throat. "Fatigue causes oversight. If you misread a document because you are exhausted, this entire process fails. You will sleep for 6 hours tonight." "I can't," she whispered, staring into her glass. "The silence in my room, it's too much." I looked at her, my jaw clenching. I understood the silence. It was a physical weight. I turned away from her, walking over to the window. The sash was old, rattling slightly in the night wind. I pulled a small screwdriver from my pocket and tightened the latch hardware, silencing the rattle. A concrete, fixable problem. "I will sleep on the sofa in the hallway," I said, my back to her. "Outside your door. You won't be alone." I heard the sharp intake of her breath. It wasn't a romantic gesture, it was a security protocol. a way to create a timeout zone where she could lower her defenses without feeling vulnerable to the empty house.
Thank you.
She said softly. I didn't turn around. I just nodded once, my eyes fixed on the dark glass of the window. Eat the sandwich, then sleep. The routine settled into a quiet, functional domesticity. We were two strangers living in a massive, hollowed-out shell, communicating primarily through acts of service. I would wake up at dawn, clear the debris from whatever wall I had opened the night before, and start the coffee maker. She would organize my discarded tools, wiping the plaster dust from the handles without saying a word. We existed in a state of suspended animation. The grief was still there, a massive, invisible elephant in every room, but the ticking clock of John Wong's deadline forced it into the background. It was raining heavily on a Thursday afternoon. The sky was a bruised purple, the water lashing against the windows in sheeted waves. I was under the grand staircase in the main hall, wedged into a tight, dark crawlspace, using a microscopic fiber-optic camera to inspect the hollow column supporting the landing. The air was stale, smelling of old pine and damp earth. The screen on my handheld monitor flickered, displaying endless gray static and the occasional spiderweb. "Jaxon?" Maria's voice echoed down the hallway. It didn't sound right. It was too high, stretched thin with panic. I backed out of the crawlspace quickly, hitting my shoulder against a floor joist. I ignored the dull pain, tossing the camera monitor aside, and stood up, brushing the dirt from my shirt. I walked quickly into the kitchen. Maria was standing rigidly by the kitchen island. In her hand, she held a thick, crisp white envelope with a stark legal seal stamped in red ink in the corner. She wasn't opening it. She was just staring at it, as if it were a live explosive. "It came certified mail," she said, her voice completely hollow. "I have to sign for it." I crossed the room in 3 long strides. I didn't ask for permission. I reached out and gently took the envelope from her trembling hands. My fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second. Her skin was ice cold. I ripped the seal open with my thumb, pulling out a single sheet of heavy bond paper. My eyes scanned the legal typography quickly, processing the data, looking for the trap. I found it in the second paragraph. "John petitioned the court," I said, keeping my voice entirely level, refusing to let the panic bleed into the room. "He claimed the property is depreciating due to neglect. The judge granted an accelerated hearing." Maria's breath hitched. "When?" I looked at the bolded date at the bottom of the page. "Next Friday. 8 days from now." The deadline moved up. The paper slipped from my hand, fluttering down to rest on the marble counter. Maria swayed on her feet, the physical manifestation of her hope finally snapping. A sudden, violent sob tore from her throat, a sound of absolute defeated exhaustion that bypassed all her defenses. She covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. "It's gone," she cried, the words muffled. "We can't find it." "He's going to take her home." I stood there, paralyzed for 3 seconds. My internal flaw, my complete inability to articulate emotion or offer verbal comfort, locked my vocal cords. I couldn't tell her it would be okay because, mathematically, our odds had just plummeted. But I couldn't let her collapse. I closed the distance between us. I didn't use soft, comforting hands. I reached out and gripped her upper arms firmly, pulling her forward. I didn't pull her into a romantic embrace. I pulled her against my chest to stop her physical shaking. I wrapped my arms around her shoulders, locking her into place, pressing her face against the solid wall of my chest. It was the principle of the quiet room. I clamped down on my own breathing, forcing my chest to rise and fall in a slow, deep, mechanical rhythm. I squeezed my eyes shut, blocking out the kitchen, the rain, the legal document on the counter. I became a sheer, unyielding structure for her to lean against. I felt her hands grab handfuls of my shirt at my ribs, gripping tight as she cried. I didn't stroke her hair or whisper soothing lies. I just stood there, absorbing the chaotic energy of her grief, acting as a physical shield against the world outside. Gradually, slowly, the frantic hitching of her breath began to match the steady, slow rhythm of my own lungs. The tremor in her arms subsided. The world stopped spinning out of control. When she finally stepped back, wiping her face with the back of her hand, I let my arms drop immediately to my sides, putting my hands deep into my pockets. I didn't linger. I didn't look at her with pity. "We have 8 days," I said, my voice a low, steady rumble. "The parameters have changed. The objective has not." I turned away from her, picking up the legal notice from the counter. I folded it sharply and put it in my back pocket. I walked out of the kitchen, heading straight for the basement door. I had 3 more rooms to tear apart before midnight. The pressure of the new deadline crushed the remaining air out of the house. The next 5 days were an exercise in extreme, sleep-deprived endurance. I abandoned the careful, meticulous mapping in favor of aggressive, destructive searching. I used a masonry drill to open inspection holes in the chimney breasts. I pulled up entire sections of hardwood flooring in the guest rooms. Maria worked beside me in silence, matching my manic pace. She had abandoned the paper trails, realizing the document wasn't filed away normally. She was checking the hollow spaces inside antique furniture, removing drawers and tapping the back panels. We were running out of house. It was Wednesday night, 2 a.m., 48 hours until the court hearing. We were in the original master bedroom, the room my wife had grown up in. I had avoided this room. The psychological weight of it was too heavy, but it was the last unchecked zone on my grid. I was sitting on the floor, my back against the heavy oak bed frame, staring blankly at the wall. My hands were covered in plaster dust, my knuckles bleeding sluggishly from a scraped bolt. I was exhausted. A deep, bone-weary fatigue that clouded my vision. Maria was sitting on the floor a few feet away, her knees pulled to her chest, staring at the empty fireplace. She looked completely defeated.
"Jaxon,"
she whispered into the quiet room.
"you need to stop. Look at your hands."
I didn't look at my hands. I stared at the intricate plaster molding running along the ceiling. I missed something. A structural anomaly. The math doesn't add up.
"Maybe it doesn't exist,"
she said gently.
"Maybe she never signed it."
"She signed it," I snapped, the words harsh and defensive. I immediately regretted the tone, closing my eyes and resting my head back against the bed frame. "She told me she did. She wouldn't leave you unprotected." The silence hung between us, heavy and sad. I felt a profound sense of failure. I couldn't save my wife from the ice on the road, and now I couldn't save her mother from losing the last piece of her legacy. I was a structural engineer whose entire life was collapsing. I opened my eyes and looked at the fireplace. It was an original 1920s design, built with heavy river stone. I had checked the chimney breast twice. Solid masonry. But as I stared at it in the dim, artificial light of my work lamp, my exhausted brain processed a discrepancy. The fireplace was centered on the wall, but the hearthstone, the massive slab of slate sitting on the floor, was slightly off-center, by exactly 2 inches to the left. I sat up slowly, my joints popping in protest. I stared at the hearthstone. It was a massive piece of rock weighing at least 300 pounds. A purely decorative flaw? Or a deliberate misalignment to hide a structural seam? I stood up, ignoring the burning ache in my thighs. I walked over to my tool bag and pulled out a heavy steel crowbar. Maria watched me, her brow furrowing.
"Jaxon, what are you doing?"
I didn't answer. I walked over to the fireplace and knelt down. I slid the flat edge of the crowbar into the microscopic seam between the slate hearthstone and the hardwood floor on the right side. It didn't fit. I moved to the left side, the side with the extra 2 inches of overhang. The steel tip slid cleanly underneath the slate. My heart hammered a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. "Maria," I said, my voice a tight, raspy command. "Come here." She scrambled to her feet and rushed over, kneeling beside me. "Shine the flashlight right here," I instructed, pointing to the seam. She clicked the heavy mag light on, focusing the beam exactly where I pointed. I gripped the crowbar with both hands, bracing my boots against the stone facade of the fireplace. I engaged my core, ignoring the screaming pain in my lower back, and applied leverage. For a long second, nothing happened. The stone was immovable. Then, with a loud, grating scrape of rock against wood, the massive slate slab shifted upward by half an inch. "Hold the light steady," I grunted through clenched teeth. I shifted my grip, pushing down on the crowbar with all my body weight. The hearthstone levered upward, exposing a dark, rectangular cavity cut directly into the subfloor beneath it. I held the heavy stone up with one hand, a dangerous, precarious balancing act. "Look inside," I ordered. Maria leaned down, shining the light into the hole. She gasped, a sharp, ragged sound. She reached in, her hand disappearing into the darkness. When she pulled it back out, she was holding a heavy, black, fireproof lockbox. I let the crowbar slip, the massive slate hearthstone crashing back into place with a deafening thud that shook the floorboards. I fell back onto the floor, my chest heaving, sweat dripping from my forehead, stinging my eyes. Maria sat back on her heels, clutching the lockbox against her chest. She was shaking violently, her eyes wide with shock. The combination dial on the front of the box was locked. "The code," I rasped, trying to catch my breath. "Her birthday," Maria whispered. Her hands were shaking too badly to turn the small dials. She looked at me, helpless. I reached out, my own hands trembling slightly from the adrenaline crash. I didn't touch her hands. I took the box gently from her grip. I dialed the 4 numbers. Month. Day. The latch clicked open with a sharp, metallic sound. I opened the lid. Inside, resting on a bed of silica gel packets, was a thick stack of heavy, legal bond paper. I pulled the papers out, holding them up to the beam of the flashlight. There it was. Addendum B. Fully executed, notarized, stamped by the county clerk 3 years ago. The title transfer was ironclad. The house belonged entirely, legally and permanently, to Maria Bird. I looked at Maria. The tension holding her together for the last month completely evaporated. Tears spilled down her cheeks, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of profound, overwhelming relief. She covered her mouth with her hand, a muffled sob escaping. But as I moved to hand her the documents, my thumb brushed against something else in the bottom of the box. A smaller, standard white envelope. It had my name written on it. Jaxon. The handwriting was familiar. The looping J, the sharp angle of the X. It was her handwriting. My lungs stopped working. The air in the room suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Maria saw the envelope. She saw the way my face froze, the way all the color drained from my skin. She gently took the legal documents from my hand, securing them against her chest. Then, she stood up slowly. She didn't say a word. She just walked out of the room, closing the heavy wooden door behind her, leaving me alone with the ghost. I stared at the envelope for a long time. The dust in the room settled around me. When I finally found the courage to tear the seal open, my hands were numb. I pulled out a single piece of lined notebook paper. It wasn't a profound philosophical treatise on life and death. It wasn't a tearful goodbye. It was a practical list. It detailed where the shutoff valve for the water main was, the specific brand of oil the antique furnace needed, and at the very bottom, a single paragraph. Jaxon, if you are reading this, it means something went wrong, and you tore the house apart to find the deed. Don't build a wall so thick no one can get in. You fix things. It's what you do. But you can't fix people. Take care of my mother. She needs your strength, but she also needs your company. Stop working for 5 minutes and just sit with her. I stared at the ink until the letters blurred. I didn't cry. My grief didn't work like that. It was a heavy, crushing pressure. But for the first time in 6 weeks, it didn't feel like a collapsing roof. It felt like a foundation settling into place. I folded the letter precisely along its original creases and put it securely in my chest pocket, right over my heart. I stood up, picked up my tools, and walked out of the room. I found Maria on the breezy afternoon porch sitting on the wooden swing. The rain had stopped, leaving the night air cold and sharp. She had the legal documents resting on her lap, her hands folded over them protectively. I walked out onto the porch. I didn't sit next to her immediately. I went to the side rail, picked up a loose baluster I had noticed a month ago, and used my impact driver to secure it silently into the bottom rail. A functional, necessary repair. Then I walked over and sat down on the swing beside her. I didn't crowd her. I left a respectful 6 inches of space between us. The paperwork is flawless, I said, looking out at the dark, wet gravel of the courtyard. John has no leverage. I'll take it to Thomas Vaughn tomorrow morning. The hearing is dead. Maria let out a long, shaky exhale, leaning her head back against the wooden slats. Thank you, Jaxon, for not giving up, for tearing the house apart. I don't leave jobs unfinished, I replied, the dryness of my tone masking the profound shift that had occurred inside my chest. The meeting at Thomas Vaughn's law office the next morning was swift and brutal. John Wong sat across the mahogany conference table looking impatient, checking his gold watch. Let's make this quick, Thomas, John sneered. Unless they found the magic paperwork, I have a probate filing to expedite. I didn't speak. I opened my leather portfolio. I didn't slide the papers across the table. I placed them, deliberately, one by one in the exact center of the polished wood. The original deed, Addendum B, the notary seal. I laid them out with the cold precision of a structural blueprint. Thomas adjusted his glasses, scanning the documents. A small, satisfied smile touched his lips. He looked up at John. Mr. Wong, this is an airtight transfer of title with survivorship rights clearly established. You have absolutely no claim to this property. If you proceed with the probate filing, we will countersue for malicious prosecution and seek full legal fees. John stared at the papers, the smugness evaporating from his face, replaced by a tight, red-faced fury. He looked at me, expecting an argument, a gloat, some emotional reaction he could exploit or demean. I gave him nothing. I sat perfectly still, my hands resting flat on the table, an immovable object. The house belongs to Maria, I stated, my voice a quiet, dangerous rumble. Do not contact her again. John snatched his briefcase off the floor, his jaw tight. This is ridiculous, he muttered, turning on his heel and storming out of the glass-walled conference room without another word. The heavy door clicked shut. The threat was neutralized. The structure was permanently secure. Maria stood up. She thanked Thomas quietly, her voice steady and clear. We walked out of the office together and got into my truck. The drive back to the estate was silent, but the quality of the silence had fundamentally changed. It was no longer the heavy, suffocating pressure of a ticking clock. It was the quiet of a job well done, of safety secured. When I parked in the gravel driveway, the mid-morning sun was hitting the stone facade of the house, warming the ivy and drying the puddles from the storm. We walked up the stone path together. At the front door, On the breezy porch where this entire nightmare had started, Maria didn't pull out her key to unlock the door. She stopped and turned to face me. She looked different. The crushing exhaustion was lifting. The lavender dress from the funeral was long gone, replaced by a simple sweater and jeans, but she looked stronger. She reached out and took my right hand. It wasn't a desperate, panicked clutch like the tissue she had held weeks ago. It was a deliberate, grounding grip. "I'm staying," she said. It was a statement of fact, a public boundary set in the bright light of day. I looked down at our hands. I didn't pull away. I let the warmth of her palm seep into my own cold, scarred skin. I didn't offer a grand declaration about the future. I didn't know how to do that. But I knew how to build a foundation. I squeezed her hand once, a solid, tactile confirmation that transferred all my stability into her grip. The tremor was completely gone. I leaned down and pressed my lips to her forehead. It was brief, heavy, and absolute. The principle of the arrival, a seal on a silent promise that the wandering, the tearing apart of walls, and the frantic panic were over. We had found the anchor. I stepped back, pulled the keys from my pocket, and unlocked the heavy oak door for her. We walked inside together, and for the first time in a very long time, the silence in the house felt like peace. I learned that true strength isn't about standing alone against the weight of the world, hiding behind walls you build to keep the pain out. It's about trusting someone else enough to share the load. Real partnership is built on silent consistency, solving the practical problems, and choosing to stay when things get heavy. Please like and subscribe so we can share more stories like this.